Hi guys! Today we are diving into torque and horsepower. Where they come from, what they do, and most importantly, which one is better to have in our car. And we'll also see how people who say things like torque is always better than horsepower may not fully understand what they are talking about. Let's get into it. Before we decide what we need more of, that beefy low-end diesel torque or the screaming high-pitched horsepower, let's first get familiar with what each actually does. Let's start with the torque. Usually, when people talk about torque, they give an example like this. Imagine you've got a nut and a spanner, and you apply force to tighten the nut. If you want to make it even tighter, you can either apply more force or use a longer spanner. Both of these actions create more of the twisting torque on the nut. This twisting force is called torque. In this case, torque is created by applying force through the leverage of the spanner. But it can also be the other way around. Let's say that this is a really long nut, so we can put on one more spanner on it. Now the torque on the nut created by force and leverage from the first spanner creates a linear force on the second spanner, and this force can be used to move other objects. That's precisely what happens with our car too. Torque produced by our engine goes on our wheel through the transmission and finally through the wheel itself ends up transformed into the linear friction force, which pushes against the road surface and propels us forward. So, if torque is what ultimately accelerates our car, does that mean torque is always the way to go? Not exactly, and here is why. Remember our spanner example. Torque doesn't just magically appear out of nowhere. It is a product of force applied through a lever. The same is true for our engine. Torque isn't just being produced magically in there. It's quite an elaborate process. At first, the piston in the cylinder goes down and sucks the fuel and air mixture into the cylinder through the intake valves. Then the valve closes and the piston goes up, compressing the mixture. And only then the mixture goes kaboom and pushes the piston down again. And that's not the end. After that, we have to open the exhaust valves and push the exhaust gases out. As we can see, torque on the crankshaft of the engine is being created by the force of the expanding gas acting through the piston and the conrod. But this torque isn't being produced continuously, it only happens once during the combustion cycle, or in other words, once every 2 rotations of the crankshaft. So, we can't just look at torque alone, we also need to consider how fast the engine is rotating, or its RPM, which stands for revolutions per minute. The more RPM, the more times torque is produced in a given minute. The combination of torque and RPM gives us the engine's horsepower. Horsepower is simply torque multiplied by RPM. We can check this by looking at any engine's power and torque chart. Pick any RPM, multiply it by torque at this particular RPM and divide it by 5252 and voila! You've got the corresponding horsepower at this RPM. The reason we divide by 5252 has to do with the units we use – horsepower, foot-pounds and RPM. If we would use standard metric units, Newton meters and radians per second, we could directly multiply torque and angular velocity and get power measured in watts. But the important thing to remember is that horsepower at the end of the day is simply torque times RPM. Now, what does power really mean? It is essentially how much work an engine can do in a given amount of time. Let's look at simple analogy. For example, imagine you've got a pile of 100 bricks and you want to move them into another pile. You can move them one at a time, say 1 brick every second. Or you can move 10 bricks at a time, but let's say it takes 15 seconds to move each batch. Which method is faster? Moving 1 brick every second gets the job done in 100 seconds, while moving 10 bricks at a time every 15 seconds takes 150 seconds. Even though you're carrying more bricks each time, the first method gets the job done quicker, meaning it makes more mechanical power overall. This is similar to how an engine works. The number of bricks you move each time represents torque, and how frequently you move them represents RPM. More RPM means torque is being applied more frequently. And the higher torque you have and the higher your RPM is, the more work your engine can do per second, which means it has more horsepower. So basically, horsepower depends on how frequently fuel combusts in the engine and how strong each of these combustions is. Power is a product of both torque and RPM, it is not a separate thing. But why do we always debate whether torque or horsepower is better? The confusion often comes from how manufacturers present horsepower. Typically, they advertise peak horsepower, the highest possible power output for an engine at a single specific RPM. The problem is, we don't drive our car at just 1 RPM all the time. So, while peak horsepower can be impressive, it doesn't tell the whole story about how the engine performs across its full range of RPM. That is precisely why we use torque RPM diagrams, where we can see both torque and horsepower in relation to every possible RPM our engine has. As we can see, at different RPM, our torque can also be significantly different. That happens because at each certain RPM, the engine works with a certain efficiency. On some RPM, air-fuel mixture fills the cylinder nearly perfectly and burns completely, in which case for this RPM we have a good torque value. On other RPMs, our engine can perform a bit worse. RPM values, where the engine performs at its best, can be seen on the diagrams as peaks of torque, and where it performs worse as dips. Engines that are made to perform well in higher rev range are usually considered as revvy or performance-oriented engines. And so-called torquey engines perform better towards the lower or middle range. For pure performance needs, like racing, we always go with revvy engines, which is why race cars almost always have really fast high-revving engines, with their peak torque placed to the high rev range. For everyday driving, these engines usually are not the greatest choice, since we rarely really need to go 180 miles per hour and jump from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. And we probably don't want to constantly rev the living hell out of our engine, right? That's why for civil use, we usually use more torquey engines. They don't give us the ultra-fast top speed and will accelerate a bit slower on higher speeds. But on lower speeds, we even may have a little advantage, because on lower RPM we have higher torque, and therefore on those lower RPMs we also have more horsepower. But only on low revs, until the revvy engine gains its RPM. Overall, more torquey engines are more suited to day-to-day life. They have better gas mileage because we use them in RPM range where the combustion is more effective. We can shift a bit less, and we don't have to rev the crap out of it to keep it running efficiently. So, as you can see, just peak power or just peak torque figures don't give us a whole picture about the engine. Torque, RPM and power go hand in hand, and to understand how the engine will perform, ideally we have to see the whole picture. In other words, we have to see the torque and power diagram. Alright, I hope this video was useful, thank you very much for watching it, and I hope to see you soon. Bye!